Hi everyone, welcome to the Adonai Old Testament Bible study. I'm your host, Kimberly Constant, and I am putting myself on camera for a minute here in these introductions. I hope to start doing this just so you can put a face to a voice. Some of you may only know me through YouTube and don't even know what I look like except for that picture on the front of the YouTube page. So here I am in the flesh and blood in my closet, which I've blurred out so you can't see. I record in my closet because it's the best for sound, really. But I just wanted to say hi. And today we are really starting the study. So last week I published a couple of videos to let you know what the study is going to be like, how to proceed through it, and giving you just background information. Why do we study the Bible? What's Bible study all about? Who am I? And why am I here and offering these courses for you? And so this week we really jump into the Old Testament. And here we're going to begin with talking about the world behind the Old Testament, the world of the ancient Near East, because it is clearly so vastly different from our own world many, many thousands of years ago. And having some kind of understanding will help us as we try to interpret and as we try to determine, like, what did this mean for the people who lived at the time this material was being put together? So that's what's coming up next. Stay with me. So let's begin by talking about the ancient Near East definition as the cradle of civilization. When we're talking about this region and time period, we're referring to the area of the world that encompasses modern day Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and portions of Syria. So a lot of what we would call the Middle East. This region is noted as the foundation of civilization, and one of its people groups, the Sumerians, are accredited with developing the oldest written language, schools, and irrigation systems as early as 3000 BC. Sometime around 2700 BC, the Akkadians became the world's first empire. And this group eventually will split into two, becoming Assyria and Babylonia. And those are important names that we will talk about later when we get into the time of Israel as a monarchy. So if we look at ages in human history, here we go, Western civilization, a review of history for some of us. Remember that we can divide up the ages according to the use of tools or weapons. So we have the Stone Age, which is approximately 3100 BC, characterized by the use of stone tools. And within this age, we had the Paleolithic time, where humans were nomad gatherers. The Mesolithic period, where there were more refined tools being used by humans, and then the Neolithic period, where they began to develop agriculture and settle into communities. And the people group that you might associate with this time are those Sumerians who I just mentioned, who really are accredited again with kind of forming the beginnings of civilization. The next age, and the age that we encounter in the beginning of the Bible, is the Bronze Age. And takes us approximately from 3100 to 1100 BC. And nowadays, I think they use BCE. This shows you how long it's been since I've been in school. But BC means before Christ. And when we talk about those years, we count what we would say is backwards. So Christ being 0, then BC goes, to 0, and then after Christ, it goes 0 forward, as we have now, where we're living in our current time period. So just in case anyone forgot that or didn't know that. So the Bronze Age, characterized by bronze tools and weapons. Some of the people groups we'll hear about in this age are the Phoenicians, those Akkadians that I mentioned, who then split into the Assyrians and Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the Hittites. And we will encounter these peoples in the Bible. Then we have the Iron Age, which takes us from approximately 1100 to 500 BC, characterized by, you got it, iron tools and weapons. And these people groups are the Arameans, the Israelites, so this is when they'll become a formalized nation, and then they become the Judeans, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and Persia. And then we have what's called the Classical era, which takes us from 500 BC all the way to 500 AD. And this is the rise and fall of ancient civilizations like Greece and Rome. That is super high level, potentially filled with errors. I don't think so, but just don't come at me if you're a history teacher. And if you are, also do let me know. I can fix this for the future. All right, the Bible in the ancient Near East. So the first 11 chapters of Genesis recount what scholars refer to as primeval history. They precede the time in which Genesis was written. In fact, they precede, in some places, the time before humans, the time before, the Sumerians came up with any sort of written language. And so it's just very much undatable history. Job is the first book that scholars associate with an actual time period in human history. Most place its setting somewhere around 2300 to 2200 BC, which is about smack in the middle of the Bronze Age, just prior to the time of Abraham. Then Abraham's story, which we pick up in chapter 12 of Genesis, is the origin story of the pre-Israelite people of God. Abraham is indeed the father of the people who will become the nation of Israel. He is known as the first of the patriarchs of the Israelite faith, and most scholars date Abraham to somewhere around 2000 BC. Then the next big chunk that we're going to look at is Exodus and Moses. When we get there, we will talk about this. The dating is debated somewhere between 1400 and 1250 BC. And then we have much more solid dates around the formation of Israel as a monarchy. They become so under King Saul around 1025 BC. And then they divide into two kingdoms after the reign of Solomon, somewhere around 965 BC. So just, again, some high-level dates to help you situate the time of the Bible within the time of human history. And I have this map here that I have borrowed from the wonderful book. Oh my gosh, now I'm forgetting the name of the book. I'll think of it. Sandra Richter, anyway, her book on the Old Testament. It's awesome. And she has this map, and so I recreated it for you. And as we move through the Old Testament, especially this year, as we're reading in chronological order, we will be looking at this map and kind of placing ourselves. So when we start, we're going to be here in the question mark area of creation, and then moving into the time of the patriarchs, which is Abraham, through Joseph and the tribes going to Egypt, which is that debated, it's debated. So you'll see two dates here for those. Then we have Joshua's conquest, the era of the judges. And then here we get to pretty reliable, solid dates around King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. So life in the ancient Near East, prior to and during the time of the patriarchs, who are Job, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've included Job as a patriarch. He's not usually put in there. I added him, but Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are considered the patriarchs. Life was nomadic. Family units moved from place to place. This is really the transition from being nomadic peoples to being more settled people groups. And identity was not situated within individual people. In our world, especially, it depends on what country you're living in. But in places like the United States where I live, your identity in a lot of places is about who you are as an individual. I would say sometimes in the southern parts of the United States, that's not as true, but it is for the most part. Back in this time, and in some places in the world even today, your identity comes from your clan or your family unit. And in this time, tribes were typically made up of people with extended kinship clans. So it wasn't enough to say, who are you? Everyone wanted to know who your people were. And that is how they would make determinations about you as a person, because it was based on your family. Once Israel moves into the Promised Land during the time of Joshua and the Judges, life became less nomadic. And the clans settled into communities comprised of housing clusters. As families grew, the cluster would grow, typically to include 3 to 4 generations living within like a clump of houses. Each family would have its own unit, so kind of picture like a townhouse in modern day times, but they were connected to one another to allow for the ease of movement within the compound. And then the village might grow to include 20 of these clusters. So each village, the smaller villages, some of the bigger cities are a bit different than this, but the villages are about 200 people typically, and they're all related to one another somehow, like fourth cousin removed relations. Laws and codes existed, but they differed from the ones that God will introduce into Israel via Moses. God's law often was more particular than the laws or anything codified in the ancient Near East. You might have heard of, for instance, the Code of Hammurabi. That's one of the codes of law that existed at that time. God typically will even be a little stricter with his law. For example, the laws against sexual immorality in the broader ancient Near East really concerned mostly incest and the prohibition of incestuous relationships. But God's law, we're going to see when we get to Leviticus and Exodus, moves beyond incest to other considerations within sexual relationships. So relationships in the ancient Near East were based, again, on that family unit. The family was the main context for understanding relationships. Outside of the family unit, relationships were created by something called a covenant. These were oaths which were formalized via a ceremony and considered binding, and we're going to talk a lot about covenants when we look at the story of Abraham. Marriage in the ancient Near East was a form of covenant. Marriages were created to produce heirs, the next generation of family, and failure to produce a child was considered disastrous and shameful, and we will see that show up in the Old Testament. Marriages were considered covenants and included the paying of a bride price or dowry. Acceptance of that money by the groom's family consisted of a legally binding marriage, and sometimes that covenant making and exchange of money would happen even years before the actual consummation of the marriage. Witnesses were required to view the beginning of that consummation, view it via something called the unpinning of the bride. So this referred to, she would have an undergarment that was pinned around her waist, and when that got unpinned, that was the first step in consummating the marriage. It didn't say my source whether they hung around for the rest of it. I'm thinking not. I'm thinking just for the unpinning ceremony. But anyway, they had to witness that part of it. And the actual consummation of the marriage itself was the final step that afforded women rights to compensation in the event of divorce or the death of her husband. So even though the legally binding contract was when the bride price was exchanged, it wasn't final until consummation. And then the woman had rights to her husband's property, or at least to be taken care of in the event of one of those things. Honor in the ancient Near East is very important. Honor and shame are sort of the way in which they operate. That even carries into the New Testament. And it was afforded to a person based on, again, the standing of their family or kinship group. There could be personal honor, but it really, in so much as you then elevated the honor of your family. The patriarch of the family was responsible for protecting the honor of the entire clan. And as you're going to see, there's a lot of genealogies, especially in Genesis, and they reflect more than just the names of the people in a clan. They also speak to social status, financial worth, and power. And the people living in the ancient Near East would see or hear, probably mostly hear, as most of them couldn't read, but hear kind of people go through the list of who they're related to, and that would tell you something about them. Again, it didn't matter who you were as an individual as much as who your people were, and that sort of determined everything about you. Hospitality in the ancient Near East is also a huge thing, and it's hard to understand when we see it in the Old Testament, especially because it's so much more than we think of it as now, although there are probably parts of the world where hospitality is closer to this. But in the ancient Near East, it was a strong point of honor. such that foreigners and sojourners were protected by hospitality codes. And we're going to see this show up in God's law as well. Violation of these codes often was seen as a greater offense than harming a family member. So keep that in mind, because there's going to be some stories in the Old Testament that we are horrified by, and they will have a little bit more of context behind them when we understand this view of hospitality. So to invite a guest into your home was to offer them food, lodging, and protection at the cost of your life or your family's lives if necessary. That's what hospitality means. It wasn't just, hey, I'm going to have a nice dinner for you and maybe a guest bed. It meant, if you're in my house, I will protect you with my life if I have to, or my family's life. And we will see this happen in the Bible. Religion in the ancient Near East, very different from what God is going to introduce via the Bible. So before God's revelation to Israel, which really begins in earnest with Abraham, ancient Near Eastern religion was polytheistic, which means worshiping many gods and goddesses, and very much nature-based. Elements of nature itself was believed to possess spirits, similar to, like, again, from the United States, the American Indian faith would have seen nature as possessing of a spirit as well. Each household had their own designated god or goddesses, like a primary one that they worshipped first and foremost, and then other household gods. When women married into a new family, they stopped worshiping the gods of their father and worshiped the gods of their husband's family. So each house, again, had their own, and that was seen as okay. It didn't matter if, everyone wasn't supposed to worship the same one primary god or goddess. They got to presumably choose for themselves who they wanted to worship. The tribes would have had temples at which they could then go to worship, cultically their gods and goddesses via sacrifices, offerings, other cultic rituals. Many of them were sexual in nature. All of this was meant to win the favor of their gods and goddesses. Some of these were human sacrifices, and we will talk more about this system when we get again to Abraham's story in Genesis and move our way through the Old Testament. In addition, the deities themselves were understood to be capricious, manipulative, self-interested, using human beings for their own purposes. So the people never had security or peace. They didn't believe that their gods loved them or cared about them at all. Again, their goal was to always try to win favor. I'm going to leave these offerings for the gods and goddesses. I'm going to engage in this sexual act. I'm going to sometimes even sacrifice another human being. And there was just never security in that. You might win favor or you might not. Very, very up in the air. In terms of their religious stories and symbols, although they worshipped different gods, everybody had like their own household god, they all ascribed to some version of creation that involved multiple gods and goddesses, a lot of anger, typically in these stories, and abuse of humans by the gods. In addition, all the ancient Near Eastern people groups told stories of a great flood and a person who, at the direction of the gods, depending on the version of the story, built a giant vessel to shelter animals and his family to survive the flood. In these ancient Near Eastern stories, the flood was an expression of wrath from the gods. So kind of keep all of this in mind as we begin to read through Genesis, because you're going to see echoes of this, but reset with God at the center. And then we also have symbolism of a tree of life that factored into most of the ancient Near Eastern religions. A lot of modern religions also have tree of life imagery. And this in the ancient Near East was connected to their worship of nature. The people also viewed the lights in the sky, the sun, the moon, and the stars as deities. Into this backdrop, God revealed himself to all of humanity. First, through the call of one man who starts off named Abram and becomes Abraham. Then we're going to see him reveal himself through the nation of Israel, and finally and fully through Jesus Christ, God's word made flesh. We talked about this in the first two lectures I gave you, the kind of the introductory ones, that this is this process of progressive revelation. God is revealing himself. He meets the people where they are, and it's so different what God's going to teach them, that he does so gently and graciously and over time and space, allowing the people to kind of grow into their understanding of who God is. In this process, God will speak God's truth. He's going to redefine the common ancient Near Eastern practices of things like covenant making, sacrifices, and worship. He's going to set the accounts of creation and the flood into their proper context with God at the center. The results will be a complete reorientation of humanity's understanding of the divine, of the human, of the world, and of their purpose. God's revelations were groundbreaking in the ancient Near East. There was nothing else like this. In our modern times, when it comes to religion, we also have Christianity, we have Judaism, and we have Islam, which kind of have similarities to everything God's going to talk about. They all have some basis in what God is doing here in the ancient Near East. So there's not just one religion that's kind of talking about the one true God. In the ancient Near East, this was it, and it was so different from what they were doing. It was absolutely groundbreaking, and that's why God has to go slow, because it's just going to take a little bit for people to understand what God is trying to do. And if you think about it, even though we do have other monotheistic religions nowadays, God's truth is still extremely groundbreaking, especially if you're a Christian and you've been through the process and you have, decided to follow God and to have a relationship. You know how life-changing it is. It was, it is, and it always will be. But for the ancient Near East, it's really just something so brand new that they didn't have context for. And that's why God goes really slowly, you're going to see, kind of compassionately, very compassionately and graciously, as he tries to teach the people not just about himself, but then, okay, now what? What does that mean for us? How are we supposed to live our lives? So as we read through the Old Testament in the order in which the events happened, again, approximately asterisk there, this is, what I think is the best chronological order, but it's not going to be perfect. We're going to pay attention to the echoes of this background information. Some things to kind of keep in mind. How do God's revelations reveal to us the common belief system and the ways of life that existed? Sort of as God's teaching things, then you can deduce from that, well, if that's what God is having to teach them, what must it have been like at that time? Another thing to think about, what would it be like to have your worldview so fundamentally redefined? Imagine that. Imagine just they had so much less scientific knowledge than we have today. Everything was, worship was so different. They were sacrificing other human beings and thinking that that was a good thing to win the favor of gods. And here comes God of Israel, the one true God, as we're going to call him next week, Elohim. And he comes in and says, no, no to all of that. Let me show you what's really supposed to happen. So another question to think about, why would God choose to meet people where they are? Why? Why wouldn't God just be like, here's the rules, here's Jesus, y'all figure it out? What does this teach us about God? So as you're reading and studying this year, continually ask yourself that question. What is this teaching me about God? What would this have taught? Put yourself in the sandals of those ancient Near Eastern people and think, what would it have been like to learn this information back then, potentially? And what is it like to learn it now? What are we learning here? And what is God showing us? Not just in what God says and what God does, but in the way he reveals it and in the spaces in between and all the contextual clues that we can pick up in the process. All right, that's it for this first lecture, and then we will start in on the book of Genesis.